So the thing Jensen learned there was to always act like you're about to go out of business. That you should run your company as if you're always 30 days from going out of business, even when that's not true. If you have that desperate cutthroat mindset at all times, you can succeed.
Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. My guest today is Stephen Witt. Stephen is an award-winning journalist and best-selling author whose work explores the hidden systems that shape modern technology and culture. His latest book, The Thinking Machine, Jensen Huang, Nvidia, and the world's most coveted microchip, won the 2025 Financial Times and Schroders Business Book of the Year award for its definitive account of Jensen Huang and the company's rise to become the foundation of the AI revolution. Stephen is also the author of How Music Got Free, a critically acclaimed investigation into digital piracy and the music industry's transformation. His reporting has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Rolling Stone, and GQ. Stephen, welcome to Technovation. It's great to speak with you today.
Thank you. Thank you.
But first, I want to thank our partner, DemoHop. CIOs are under pressure to deliver innovation faster, reduce duplicate work, and clearly demonstrate the impact of what's being built across the organization. But today, innovation happens in pockets. Great work is happening, it just isn't visible beyond the teams doing it. That's why Fortune 100 technology organizations use DemoHop. It's a SOC 2 certified platform that provides a clear portfolio-level view of company-wide innovation, purpose-built for internal demo days, quarterly planning, and virtual tech showcases. DemoHop turns one-off moments into enterprise-wide visibility for everyone, not just leadership. It's how modern CIOs scale innovation, build credibility for their technology organizations, and align execution with strategy. Learn more at demohop.com. That's DEMOHOP.com. And now on to the interview. Well, why don't we begin with the genesis of this project? What's led you down the pathway to writing this book? Obviously, an executive of consequence, a company of consequence as well. But talk about the genesis of the project from your perspective.
Yeah, well, the easy story is that I thought I found the guy who was the biggest mover and shaker in AI and just went after him, but that's a lie. What actually happened was I started using ChatGPT and I was like, oh my God, I am cooked. I better lean into this AI stuff because this thing can write almost as well as I can, if not better. And it produces prose at the rate of 1,000 words a second, which I can't do. So I was looking around for a good AI story. And I initially was going to be like, okay, I'll write about OpenAI, but that was very, very crowded. And so I was like, maybe there's some other way into this. And I was like, well, yeah, what about the back end of this stuff? What about this hardware I'm hearing about? And this was a less accessible story in some ways. Most people, even to this day, you meet people, they have no idea who Nvidia is, even though they're the most valuable company in the world. I often have to explain what they do and what they make to sort of lay people because they don't really make a consumer-facing product. I mean, even their video game cards were very niche consumer product. It's not like everyone was even aware they were in their computers. So that led me to Jensen, which is a very surprising story because usually when you read about a company like Nvidia, they've had 4 or 5 CEOs over the years. They've had multiple changes of strategy. It's a confusing story. There's not like an easy package to put on it. But in this case, I got very lucky because Jensen had in fact been the same executive running the same company since its inception in 1993. With over 30 years of experience, he was in fact the single longest tech CEO serving in any company in the tech sector in the S&P 500. So he had this very long duration in charge. He founded the company in a Denny's restaurant way back in 1993 with his co-founders and managed it ever since. That was a very compelling story because with Nvidia, there was 20 years where they were just not doing that well. It took them a long time to find AI, and it took them a long time to really become the successful company that they are today. Now they are the most valuable company in the world. By some measures, the most valuable company in human history, actually. So it turned out to be a great story. That was not true when I started writing it, actually. They were only about the 6th most valuable company in the world when I started. So I got very lucky in that respect, too. And as I got closer to Jensen, I was like, wow, this guy has a magnetic personality. He's a fascinating person. He's brilliant. He's complicated. He's kind of like daring. It's every quality that you want in the hero of your book that you're writing the biography about. So I got very lucky in that regard too. It's not always the case with corporate executives that they're that interesting to write about. But Jensen,
yeah. That's a confluence of a variety of factors that certainly make this very interesting. You do a really nice job of telling the story of his younger years, an immigrant from Taiwan, goes to boarding school in Kentucky. Can you talk a little bit, just in brief, about the very formative period of his time in Kentucky, and how that your own analysis of some of the seeds that were planted there that would yield some of the fruit you've just described?
Jensen had a fascinating and peripatetic childhood. He was born in Taiwan in 1963. Lived there till he was only 5 years old. Then moved to Thailand, Bangkok, with his mom and dad. His dad has a job as a petroleum engineer. His dad was also an engineer. But then Thailand was beset by political instability in the 70s. I think there was a near coup d'etat, or almost a revolution. There were tanks in the street. There was violence, and Jensen's dad was like, "We got to get the kids out of here." Now, they had been planning a move to the United States already, but they accelerated it and sent Jensen and his older brother to the U.S. ahead of the family. One of the first wave of what were later called parachute kids, who were sort of sent to establish an immigration beachhead in the U.S. in anticipation of their parents coming. So Jensen arrives. He's living with his uncle, and his uncle decides that the kids should go to an elite boarding school. But he didn't really understand much about U.S. society or how to navigate it. So he found one of the only boarding schools in the United States that was willing to accept a 10-year-old kid, right? Which is the Jensen's age at the time. And that was the Oneida Baptist Institute in Clay County, Kentucky. Now, it seems that Jensen's uncle thought this was a prestigious college preparatory school. In fact, this school was basically a reform school for last chance juvenile delinquents. So Jensen and his brother show up there. The whole place is covered in cigarette butts. They've only known it from a brochure that they saw once. And all of the kids have like criminal histories. Some of them are carrying knives around. And Jensen is put in a dormitory with a 17-year-old roommate who'd recently been stabbed in a knife fight. So this is like, and Jensen barely speaks English, right? He's an immigrant. He's probably the only Chinese person of Chinese ancestry in any direction for about 500 miles. Everyone's like, the kind of white children of tobacco farmers and coal miners. So kind of like this is a very poor county. Even to this day, about 70% of the people who live in this county are on welfare or qualify for EBT. And so it's a tough environment, very tough environment. And Jensen is bullied both on account of his size. He was small, and of course on account of his race. He was subject to a lot of racist abuse in Kentucky. Each day he had to cross a bridge to go to elementary school. And the bridge was this kind of like rickety rope swing bridge, like hanging bridge. And the kids sometimes would come to both sides of the bridge and shake the bridge as Jensen was on it. And he's in the middle of it trying to knock him off, dislodge him into the river below. So it's just this incredible environment. And I think a lot of kids would have folded in these circumstances, right? For a lot of kids, this would be, oh my God, I'm being racist bullying, I'm being targeted. But Jensen thrived. And I think this is the most amazing thing about him. He was a grade behind everyone. He was the youngest kid at the school. He was, him and his brother were, I think, the only Asian kids at the school. And, amazingly, he became one of the most popular people in the school and excelled academically. Jensen has said that this was actually one of the most important things in his life, the most important things in his upbringing. He'd come from, he was a good student. He'd come from a background where he got good grades and did his homework and was diligent. I think he had all of those qualities. But then he learned to survive in an environment where there were really just kind of no rules at all of a sudden, in the absolute opposite of where you'd expect a good student to be. And he did great. And I think this is in some ways his secret. He's very smart, but he's also very adaptable. And he learned how to basically win in a knife fight in the school. And that turned out to be a great asset in business later on.
Fascinating beginnings, to say the least. Another very important stop on his journey was at LSI Logic, a company he worked for just prior to joining the founding team, becoming a co-founder of Nvidia. It was there, as you described, that he chose to work on the most difficult problems that the most difficult customers would surface. And this became almost like a mantra of his. And a very important philosophical point as he would go on to become an entrepreneur. Talk a little bit about the genesis of that, and also the advantage of seeking these very difficult problems.
Yeah, Jensen's first job was actually drawing the circuitry on a microchip on paper and then delivering it to kind of be transferred to these kind of like cellophane or kind of transparent proofs and then sent off to the printer. So this was the state of the art when Jensen joined the microchip industry in the early 80s. Then LSI kind of took what he was doing and computerized it. Why are we having people draw this? We'll have the computer draw the diagrams. And at the time Jensen joined the industry on a microchip, you'd expect maybe a few thousand components. And now we're at a few hundred billion. So obviously we've reached past the stage where a single human could draw out the microchip. But Jensen was there. I mean, he was there at the beginning, almost like artisanal microchips. He came to LSI and he was a technical worker. And then some of the customers were coming to LSI with the most complex technical kind of requests that they could get. And the salespeople basically didn't even understand them. So as Jensen's co-founder, Chris Malachowski, described it, they reached deep into the bowels of the company for the most technical person they could find who could still talk to customers. And that was Jensen. And so Jensen met Chris, who had this very complex customer request to do a complicated graphics card, which Jensen had no experience in up to that time. And Jensen was able to meet Chris's request. Basically, since then, his entire career has just been amplifying that same event over and over. He finds the customer the most technically complex demands he can find and says, well, maybe I can meet this person's demands. And what makes Jensen so special is he will actually lose money to build tools for some of these people. He will lose money to build tools for cutting edge scientists. He'll design a product for a scientist that has very few users, very few. I mean, the market is saturated once 5 or 6 people are using this product. But Jensen's way of thinking is, well, if I do that, I'll always be on the cutting edge. And somehow, sometimes, every once in a while, we will open essentially a new branch of science, a new branch of capabilities for computers. And then we can have an entire industry grow around us. And indeed, that's exactly what occurred, both with graphics and later with AI.
You also write about his extraordinary capacity to learn. Everything from table tennis to pricing theory. You've got a fantastic anecdote in the book about an argument he has with somebody who's ostensibly...
I see you've read this book quite closely. Yeah,
I did indeed. It's a great read. It's a very good read. And talk a bit about, more generally speaking, this capacity he has to learn and his delving not an inch deep, but very deep into a variety of topics that one might consider esoteric in order to build his skills as an entrepreneur, as a CEO.
Yeah, I think there's kind of 3 things there. He has a high IQ. He has a high general IQ, higher than almost probably anyone I've ever met. He works exceptionally hard. And then I think, and this is the real secret, he really understands where it's an engineering mindset, where bottlenecks are, right? So if I'm learning table tennis, and this is a hard thing to do when you practice anything, like I'm learning the piano, right? So if you're learning the piano, what's the worst part of my piano playing? What's the worst part of my table tennis game? What's the hardest thing to do in my industry? And people will shy away from that, right? So most practice is not really that productive, they say, because you're not really tackling the thing that you're worst at. You're not polishing. When you practice a piano piece, for example, you actually should focus on the very hardest part of the piece and then just relentlessly drill that into your fingers rather than starting from the beginning and practicing through the piece each time. And Jensen's good at this, right? So when he's learning something, he'll really be great at assessing what is the most challenging or difficult bottleneck to my own knowledge, and then just attacking that relentlessly for days at a time. I mean, when he was learning table tennis, he slept in the table tennis practice court. He slept there overnight and just, ruthlessly focused on his weaknesses in his game, to the point where he kind of started when he was 15. He did not play table tennis in China. Started when he was 15 in the US, and by 6 months later, he was a nationally ranked player. It was extraordinary how fast he was able to learn this. It's a combination, I think, of just being gifted intellectually, being willing to work 14 plus hours a day on one thing. That kind of monotonic focus is hard to find. Most people burn out. I would burn out. And then I think especially the kind of project management kind of mindset of a good engineer. All right, what do I need to learn? How long would it take me to learn it if I dedicated myself completely to it? Where's the bottlenecks, and what inputs and outputs can I modify to make myself better at this thing? So Jensen attacks every problem in this way. Table tennis, deep learning, pricing theory, business. The guy the anecdote you mentioned, that guy had an MBA Jensen was arguing with, but Jensen just knew way more about the practical aspects of pricing products. He had read everything on the MBA syllabus already. And not only that, but internalized it much better than the guy he was arguing with. He was just a better student. He'd done his homework. Jensen does his homework. He's the guy who does his homework.
He was not a natural entrepreneur necessarily. And I think a lot of what you just described as his attributes are the answer to the question I wanted to ask you next, which is what did his two eventual co-founders in Nvidia see in him that convinced them that he was the one who should be the one leading the company? As it seemed like that was the consensus view. There was no argument around this. Was it the raw IQ, the work, the work ethic, the ability to go deep, or were there other aspects that you would underscore as?
It's very interesting. Curtis Preem and Chris Malachowski as co-founders really came to Jensen and said, "Do you want to be the CEO of a company?" Which is a weird thing for two guys to ask. Curtis was an eccentric guy and remains a pretty eccentric guy. He wouldn't function as a CEO. And I think even he acknowledged that. Like, I could never be the CEO of a company. He's a weird guy. Chris, just didn't want to, I think. He was like, I don't want to manage people. I don't like doing that. I'm not good at managing large groups of people. Jensen at LSI by his late 20s had been so successful that he was already managing a group of 250 people. So he had shown the ability to be a manager and to be a hard driving manager and to, the ability to do business strategy, the ability to not just be technical. Curtis and Chris are very technically skilled. They're highly technically skilled. And Jensen has said that he could NVIDIA never would have succeeded without them. In fact, it was actually Curtis who came up with the name NVIDIA, and who came up with the concept of pursuing the graphics market. That stuff did not come from Jensen. But I think Jensen understood how to kind of manage a team, and they'd seen him do that, and they were very impressed at his ability to do that. And so I think this is what attracted them to Jensen. I think also they identified his drive, his ambition, his IQ. It's funny, and I tell this anecdote in the book. Chris remembers very clearly, and they were friends too. Chris remembers very clearly having dinner at Jensen's house and Jensen telling him that he wanted to run something by the age of 30. He really wanted to run his own company by the age of 30. And I said to Jensen, "Do you remember that?" He's like, "No, I never said anything like that. I don't remember that at all." And I went back to Chris. He's like, "You sure you said this?" He's like, "Yes, I remember it very distinctly." So I think within Jensen, there was a certain ambition and drive that he will not admit to, but I am confident was there.
You note in great detail the extent to which NVIDIA's success was far from inevitable. In fact, the company is at multiple points in the narrative essentially running on fumes. That was a quote of his at one point in the book. And frankly, I mean, it almost seems like they were the knife's edge so many times. There was a great possibility this company would have failed multiple times over. And I wonder, on the one hand, it's not a company that's had sort of marshaled progress at a regular pace across the multiple decades it's been in business, but it has hit those key pivot points with alacrity, and that seems like an enormous difference maker. Provide a bit more detail there, if you would.
Sure. So they started out entering the graphics processing unit market. Now, the idea here is we're going to take the same hardware that runs a video game console and put it in your PC so you can play high-end games on your PC. This turned out to be a huge market. Everyone saw it, though. I think there were 70 companies in this space. So Jensen and Chris and Curtis, their original premise is like, well, we're just the best engineers in this space, so we're going to make the best product. Not true. And their first product flopped. So then they're just running out of money. And like, what do we do? And Jensen basically says, all right, if we can't be the best, we're going to be the fastest. So we're just going to churn out new products very quickly we're going to do copycat products, and we're just going to beat our competitors to market all the time. And Curtis actually hated this idea. They got in a huge fight, and Curtis was sort of sidelined. Ultimately didn't contribute a lot to NVIDIA's success over the years. But Jensen made that work. And so they beat their competitors to market in 96 with what was basically a Me Too product, but it was on shelves 3 months before anyone else. And that was enough to keep them alive, at least for a little while. And then they took the findings from that, and Jensen was just like, all right, the key finding here is that when we were facing bankruptcy, and they were about to turn the lights off. They couldn't pay the light bill, basically, was where this company was at in 95 or 96. And in fact, their chief scientist only came on board. He only came on board with the stipulation that he would only work for the company if he was handed a physical check at the 5 p.m. Friday at the end of each work week, because he did not think the company would stay in business longer than that. He gave them 1 week of credit. That's how much he was willing to extend to them. So he was like, yeah, it was day to day whether they could keep the lights on over there. But they did succeed. And then they did start to innovate again. And soon they were the 70 companies, they won that fight. I've compared it to the movie Battle Royale. I don't know if you've ever seen this. It's a Japanese movie where a bunch of kids are trapped on an island and they have to fight to the death until only one is left. That was the GPU market. That's what it looked like. And Jensen won that knife fight. He won it. 70 companies in 1994, 1995. By 2001, there were really only two, and his was the biggest. And the way he did that was by very ruthlessly raiding the engineering talent from his competitors. I mean, him and David Kirk would scheme. They'd have a whiteboard up with a list of the best engineers in the other companies and how they were going to get them, poach them, and convince them to come work for Nvidia. And they were successful in doing that. So the thing Jensen learned there was to always act like you're about to go out of business, that you should run your company as if you're always 30 days from going out of business, even when that's not true. If you have that desperate cutthroat mindset at all times, you can succeed. Now, the other thing he learned, and he was kind of less willing to put this in print, it's not fun to participate in Battle Royale. It's not fun to be in Squid Game. It's not fun to, be in a knife fight with 70 other people that you have to win. So the other lesson is now Jensen has won this fight, but he's covered in scars, and he's disinclined ever to participate in another Battle Royale. And so for the rest of NVIDIA's history and the rest of NVIDIA's career, they really steered away aggressively from arenas where there was even one other competitor, much less 70. They were never going to fight to the death again in some kind of very crowded space. Jensen himself acknowledged, it was like extremely lucky that we, at one point in the company, he was like, it was 50-50 that we would survive. He was never going to do that again. He was going to always look for what he called $0 billion markets, where basically there were not only no competitors, there weren't even customers. He was going to build products that were so cutting edge that he would, almost like a Field of Dreams strategy, where he'd build a baseball field and then wait for players to arrive. And that's really what NVIDIA spent the rest of its time doing. And we can go into what that looked like, but that was the lesson from the graphics days. There's three lessons probably. A, to the greatest extent possible, poach your competition's best engineering talent and get them to come work for you. B, always act like you're going out of business. And C, don't get in any knife fights.
Super interesting. You also talk about how part of his advantage in being able to take these sorts of bet is his domain expertise. That yes. You contrast this, for example, relative to Intel, that at points where, the two of them were in competition, where perhaps Intel could have been in a position to squash Nvidia. They were run by MBAs. They were not run by computer scientists and people with the depth of knowledge that he has. Clearly a tremendous advantage that he's been able to parlay in a variety of directions, as you point out.
Yeah, that domain expertise. Jensen has a degree in electrical engineering from Oregon State University, and then a master's from Stanford. And then he reads about it constantly, and he's done nothing his entire life but design microchips. I think if Jensen was not the CEO of NVIDIA, if for some reason he wasn't in management, he'd just be another guy getting patents on new designs for microchips, and he'd probably have like 200 patents, right? So he has the mindset of both the killer instinct of the executive, but also that deep technical knowledge. It's almost like Thomas Edison or somebody. You really have to go back to Thomas Edison to find somebody like this. Andy Grove, who ran Intel, also had both of these things. But as Intel matured, they got away from the technical side. The people who were running the company did not have such a firm technical background, and they really suffered for that. To run this kind of industry, to compete in this kind of industry, Lisa Su of AMD also has this. You need to know how to design the microchip from scratch. You need that advanced degree in electrical engineering. You need it. You absolutely need it. You cannot win in this industry without it. And when I mean you need it, I mean the CEO has to have it. I think it's one of the reasons NVIDIA succeeded while Intel failed. And, Jensen will be around for a long time, but whoever ends up succeeding Jensen also must have that very deep technical knowledge, not just of AI, not just of business strategy, not even just of programming, but really how the computer actually works from the circuit up, from the transistor up. And that's harder to find.
Parallel computing, Stephen, is a topic that people had contemplated for some time, though it had a checkered history and was largely viewed as a dead end for those who might contemplate pursuing it. It was much easier to wait for Moore's law to simply get to doubling a capacity and acting accordingly. What did Jensen and John Nichols see as this opportunity that others missed, and how did they capitalize on it?
They foresaw the end of Moore's law, which Intel did not see. Now, what is Moore's law? Well, we've heard it typically as, you hear, well, every 18 to 24 months, computers are going to double in speed, right? Not quite. If you go back to what Moore actually said, he said every 18 to 24 months, the number of components that we can put on a microchip can double. Now, for a long time, those two things were the functional equivalent. If we put more components on the microchip, we're going to speed up the microchip. But at a certain level, your components are going to get so tiny that they're going to actually start to violate basic principles of physics. Now, when Moore formulated this law in the 1960s, this was not a concern. But by the late 1990s, early 2000s, if you looked at the product roadmap, you were like, wow, we're building transistors that are 1 atom in width. Like, we can't get any lower than that. We're starting to run into like quantum physics effects. And in particular, we're starting to compromise the integrity of these components. They're leaking electricity into the kind of like adjacent silicon substrate. So that means Moore's law has to come to an end. As classically formulated, we cannot follow the strategy of packing more components onto the microchip forever. We have hit the physical limits of the universe about what we can do on this. Nvidia accepted that this was true and Intel did not. And that was the big difference. If you look at when CUDA started in 2003 and 2004, sorry, not CUDA, but the parallel programming, kind of the big shot effort to do parallel computing at Nvidia. If you go and look at what Intel was saying at the same time, they're saying, well, we're just going to keep packing more components onto the microchip until we get to a clock speed of 10 billion gigahertz. Don't worry about what that means technically. All you need to know is that to this day has not been achieved. So Intel was planning to do the physically impossible. And Nvidia was willing to recognize, no, you can't do that. You have to do something else. Now, what does this mean in terms of how we run computers? Well, nobody wanted to do what is called the parallel computing approach. And the difference there, very quickly, serial computing, Intel's approach is basically we're going to solve one math problem at a time. NVIDIA's parallel approach is we're going to break that math problem into hundreds of smaller problems and solve them all at once. That's faster, but it's also much harder to program. It introduces all sorts of complications when you're writing software. And so for decades, the reason parallel computing didn't succeed is you would go to the software guys and say, well, listen, I can speed up your program, but you have to refactor 1 million lines of code. And the software guys would be like, yeah, great. I think I'll just wait for Intel to come out with a better product. What NVIDIA foresaw was that Intel could no longer come out with that better product and that these developers would be forced now to refactor 1 million lines of code. They'd have no choice if they wanted their applications to speed up. That was a big gamble. And there was a lot of disagreement within the industry at that time about whether or not these things were true. But Jensen, who had that deep domain knowledge, knew it had to be true. And he knew it from first principles of electricity. He knew it from like first principles of physics. And basically bet the company that Moore's law was going to come to an end. And that turned out to be correct. I know that's a technical explanation. I'm not sure how technical your listeners are. If you have questions or you don't understand, just yell at me on Twitter.
That's fantastic. Yeah, no, great level of detail there. I think that was really nicely done. You briefly mentioned CUDA, the Compute Unified Device Architecture of Nvidia, which, by the way, looked like a commercial failure initially. It was
one could even say it was designed to be a commercial failure on purpose.
Exactly. You get another one of these examples, right? Of build it and they will come, even if it takes a while for people to realize that baseball diamond is actually there in Iowa.
Yeah. So what was happening here was the graphics cards were getting really sophisticated in terms of their circuitry. And scientists were actually hacking the graphics cards to get to those circuits so they could run more complex calculations in domains like quantum physics or weather forecasting. And Jensen and his team saw that and they're like, well, don't hack the circuits. We'll build you a platform to do that. And that platform was called CUDA. Don't ask what it stands for. It doesn't matter. It's kind of meaningless. So now they're kind of attracting the scientific computing community to run graphics applications, or start to run scientific applications on these graphics cards. Now, who is CUDA for? Who is this for? Well, it's not for established research scientists because those guys can afford time on a conventional supercomputer. right? It's for marginalized scientists who have no money and who are forced to jerry-rig homebrew supercomputers by chaining 20 graphics cards together. It's for guys who have no money. It's for mad scientists, basically, who have kind of out of favor, wacky ideas that they can't get the research budget to pursue and need to hack a graphics card to do their kind of work that they need. And so that was the market, the mad science market. That's what Jensen was targeting. And as you might imagine, those guys don't have a lot of money and it's not a very big market. So for about 10 years, Nvidia lost money. I mean, year over year, lost money building this platform. Investors hated it. Customers thought it was ridiculous. And the way they were able to do this, by the way, was by raising the prices of the graphics cards they sold to the gamers so that they could fund what looked like this kind of like Doc Brown, Back to the Future style crazy science project. But Jensen's gamble, there was a logic to it, was that if we can find some branch of science that needs millions of times more computing power at an affordable rate, if we continue to supply the market with these low budget supercomputers, someday some new branch of science will be unlocked and an entire industry will grow around it, and the default software and hardware platforms will default to Nvidia. And so what looks like a very small market with zero customers will one day be an industry dominating market with hundreds of millions of customers. Having said that, even they did not anticipate just how successful this could possibly have become.
You tell this fantastic story about how there was an NVIDIA event, I think it was in early 2013, where Jensen's keynote, AI was not mentioned once. And then a year later, he declared by email that NVIDIA would become an AI first company. Talk a bit about that. That's quite a change in a matter of months. Talk a bit about what transpired to lead to that sort of a dramatic pivot.
So we've got our low budget supercomputer for the mad scientists, and they're like, well, who's going to use it? And they make this big list in NVIDIA. And the list is, well, maybe geologists will use it to do oil prospecting because that's very computationally intensive. Maybe we'll do medical imaging, like for breast cancer, tomography, that kind of thing. Maybe we'll do computer vision. Maybe we'll do a big list of things. But one thing that was not on that list at all was AI. And in particular, inside AI, there was a neglected branch of AI called neural networks, which basically were biological simulations of how the human brain worked. We chained together a bunch of synthetic neurons and computer code and then ran them to try and get kind of machine intelligence results. Now, I have to get it back. I have the 2011 Norvig and Russell textbook on AI. So this is the standard introductory textbook to AI from 2011. It is 1,130 pages long. Of those 1,130 pages, 10 are devoted to neural networks. That was the state of neural networks within AI, which was already a career graveyard in 2011. So that's how marginalized this was. Neural networks were seen as basically bonkers, like especially within the United States. Nobody was working in it. There was no funding for it whatsoever. And the people who did work on it were viewed as extremely eccentric and unlikely to succeed. What were they missing? Well, they were missing 1 million times more computing power. And in 2012, in Toronto, this marginalized research group led by Jeffrey Hinton, who has now won the Nobel Prize, and his graduate students, Ilya Sutskever of OpenAI fame, the third guy named Alex Krzyzewski, built a pioneering neural net that ran dozens of times better than any other neural net before. It excelled at computer vision, and it was really good at identifying objects and labeling them. And so they did this on 2 NVIDIA gaming GPUs that they ran in Krzyzewski's bedroom for a week. So this was the ultimate mad science experiment. We're going to take this guy's crazy low budget supercomputer. We're going to take this crazy technology that nobody believes in. We're going to combine them in my bedroom, in my childhood bedroom, in the bedroom he grew up in his house, and we're going to produce the world's first superintelligence. And by God, it worked. And so that was the pivot point. That happened in 2012. It still took about a year for it to filter back up to Jensen. That's how out of favor neural networks were. It was like inventing cold fusion. Nobody believed it worked at first. In fact, most AI people, the first time they saw it, were convinced that Krzyzewski's results had to be an error, but they weren't. He built the best kind of like computer vision labeling device in history. And since then, almost everything that has happened has simply been an amplification of what Krzyzewski has done. He used 2 GPUs in a bedroom. Now we use 200,000 in a data center, but we're functionally running almost exactly the same experiment still.
Talk about that period, if you would, between then and the introduction, the broader introduction of generative artificial intelligence, and the pathway that Jensen and Nvidia took to continue to grow and influence that remarkable leap that came just a few years back.
The way I like to think about it is this. Jensen was building propellers, and he kept going to the maritime industry. He's like, who wants a better boat propeller? And the boat guys are like, no, we're going fast enough. We don't need to stop building these propellers. And meanwhile, Krzyzewski and his group, they were building gliders, and they were like pushing these gliders off the cliff, and they would, crash. And the glider guys would get, God, how are we going to get this glider off the ground? How are we going to make this thing fly? And Jensen's like, who am I going to sell these propellers to, right? Well, you put them together and you have an airplane, and that airplane takes off, and suddenly there's a huge industry. Instantly, there's a gigantic industry. And that's what happened. I mean, by 2015, 2016, you had all of this VC money flowing into AI. But similarly, they were a little limited, just like early airplanes, in what they could do. They were just a little too rickety for a lot of more production use cases, and they just didn't go quite fast enough. In late 2017, early 2018, a group at Google invented a new kind of neural network architecture called a transformer, and that was like the jet engine. Okay, so that took AI from like cool but maybe experimental technology to production level. Look what we can do with this stuff. And then shortly thereafter that, we entered the phase of what's called generative AI. Before that, we sort of had descriptive AI. So the computer vision stuff was very good at labeling a scene, but it couldn't really generate its own images. The transformer unlocked the ability of the AI not just to label images, but actually to produce its own images and text based on sort of what it had absorbed. And that led to fantastic products that started to appear kind of in the early 2020s, like the GPT series from ChatGPT, and stuff like Stable Diffusion, the image generation stuff like DALL-E, and that stuff quickly took over and became very, very popular. Now, what was happening there was essentially applications of scale to the transformer. What they were finding is, hey, if we throw more and more microchips at this problem, we can make this AI smarter and smarter in a fairly direct fashion. In fact, we're still living in what has been called like the scaling era. We're still scaling this stuff up. That's why there's so much investment in data centers, and that's the thing that makes Nvidia the most valuable company in the world right now. Is the more microchips we throw at this problem, the better these computers seem to do. We haven't hit any kind of plateau yet. I'm sure we will someday, but we haven't hit it yet. And so as long as that happens, our computers get smarter. More computing power thrown at AI equals better AI. And that has been true more or less continuously now for 13 or 14 years.
I want to ask you a little bit about the culture of NVIDIA. It's a fascinating place, famously intense, no work-life balance, as you point out. Jensen's own style he pushes people incredibly hard. He's known to scream at them, certainly. Yep. And yet there's this psychological, everything I've said so far, by the way, would seem to be antithetical to psychological safety. But what one of the key attributes of all this is he rarely, if ever, fires people.
Yeah, you have to do something really egregious. I mean, I think
exactly. If you stole, you get fired.
Or harassing your coworkers, you'll get fired. But basically, you never get fired for performance slip-ups. You do get demoted. So Jensen will absolutely take responsibilities away from you. And in fact, I've talked to at least one person who was demoted twice within NVIDIA. They never fired him. They just kept producing instead of responsibilities. And that actually goes all the way back to Curtis, his co-founder. I think this was the first person Jensen really did this to. Curtis was originally essentially the architect of NVIDIA's products. This is the kind of unusual guy, and their products just weren't working there well. And Jensen just kept reducing his responsibilities until he was basically the guy managing the patent portfolio. And Curtis went along with it. So I think the premise there is it's going to be hard to work for Jensen. You're going to get screamed at, for sure, and you're not going to see it coming even necessarily when he's going to scream at you. You're going to hit the tripwire. You're not even sure where it is. And then you're going to get an absolute dressing down from the boss. And not only that's going to happen in public, and 100 people are going to watch it happen. And it's going to be brutal. But the flip side is, you're working on especially now, the most interesting technology in the world, if not in human history in some ways. B, you're never going to get fired. You always have the level of job security where maybe your responsibilities will be reduced, but you won't lose your job. And then C, Nvidia is an extremely generous employer, especially with stock options. And if you stick around and hold on to that stock, you will get paid. Like, I think something like half the company now has a net worth above $25 million. And what happened is that Jensen basically so back in the early days of CUDA, back in the kind of pre-AI days, the stock price looked like the EKG of somebody having a heart attack. It basically didn't go up for 15 years, and it was just spiky. And so people would buy stock in Nvidia through their employee stock option purchase program, and then instantly they'd be like 70% underwater, and they'd be like, what the hell? So Jensen instituted a program where he's like, okay, I hear you. Rather than buying stock at a discount to the current market price, you can buy stock at a discount to any price Nvidia has traded it in the last 2 years. And that way you won't lose money if the stock is bouncing around. Well, somewhat inadvertently, this turned out to be the greatest stock trade of all time if you worked for Nvidia, especially once the AI era hit and Nvidia stock was like doubling or even quadrupling every year, basically. And it did that continuously. It just basically went up for 12 straight years. So you could, in 2015, when the stock price had gone up 10x, you could still buy it at the 2013 price and at a discount to the 2013 price. So it's basically free money. So everybody maxed out their contribution each year, all of the employees, because it was just free money. And then if they held on to it, then it went up another 100x. So they all became extremely wealthy. What's amazing about that is not that many people left. There's so many people are still there working relentlessly to build this new technology. It's like, you have like close to $1 billion. Why are you coming and busting your butt at this company for 14 hours a day with this, very demanding boss in this highly competitive industry? And the answer is FOMO. The answer is not that they're motivated by money, but that they're motivated by the fact that they are, in fact, working on the great technological paradigm shift of our time.
Good.
And these guys are engineers, and they can't afford not to work on that. It would be psychologically painful to watch AI come into existence and not play a role. And that's what motivates them.
Fascinating. We talked about how mercurial he can be. He raised his voice with you, actually, when you attempted to ask him questions about the risks associated with artificial intelligence. That's how optimistic he is about how positive AI's advances will be. Talk a bit about that. I mean, that almost seems irresponsible for somebody in his position. I mean, on the one hand, I suppose you could say it helps fuel the continued
His point of view
growth.
is that the other people are being irresponsible. His point of view is that people are entertaining preposterous science fiction scenarios that aren't supported by data. So, and this is, I mean, I will say, I don't think I deserve to get yelled at, but it was like the third or fourth time I asked this question. And I just thought it was important. I just couldn't let go of it. I still can't let go of it. I'm still asking you. They actually just wrote a whole thing for the New York Times about the prompt that could end the world and the risks that are presented by AI. But for Jensen, at least, he just doesn't want to hear it. He just doesn't see it. And this is the way that Jensen, who resembles Elon Musk in a number of ways, but this is the way he's really different from Musk. Musk is going to start with some science fiction vision, right? He's going to start with the idea of himself being, standing on the surface of Mars and then moving backwards to the technology that he needs to build to get him there. Jensen is the opposite. He doesn't have a particular vision of where technology is going to go. And in fact, he's as surprised in some ways as anyone to be participating in the AI revolution. That was certainly not in NVIDIA's founding charter. That was a huge pivot, and it came as much as a surprise to him as anyone, although he jumped on it when he saw it. But yeah, so he is going to just look at what the circuits can do today, what the programming can do today, reason critically about what's going on in business today and where it might go tomorrow and where it might go in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. And he will project forward as long as logic and reason permit it and data supports it. But he will not go into the realm of speculative science fiction. He told me, and I don't know if I totally believe this, but he told me, and I guess it's true, he had never read a science fiction book. He'd never read a science fiction novel his entire life. Maybe it's true. I mean, the thing that actually made him jump at me was not that I kept bringing up risk. I just showed him a clip of Arthur C. Clarke talking about the future of mechanical brains, because much of what has occurred, Clarke really predicted way back in the 60s. And he just exploded at me. He was just like, I don't read Arthur C. Clarke. I didn't read those effing books. Like, I didn't He just did not want to hear the science fiction perspective. So I thought that was fascinating, and it defines who he is. I will say, having talked to a lot of people within NVIDIA, there are times when Jensen's tantrums can be a little self-indulgent. They're not always so productive. I think sometimes he is just blowing off steam. Sometimes I think he's flexing his muscle, a little ego trip maybe. But for those who work there, I was talking to one guy who more recently, this is not in the book because the guy I didn't actually contact me after the book came out. I'm hoping to put it in a future edition. And Jensen started yelling at him about this thing or that thing. Some product he had developed had a lot of bugs. And Jensen kind of looked at the guy. He's like, maybe there's only one bug. Maybe it's you. And the guy was like, you know what? You can't talk to me this way. And he quit on the spot. He just resigned. That guy now heads Google's engineering effort, basically in direct competition with Jensen. So saying, there's certain people just like, you can't talk to me this way. You can't tolerate it. I'm not going to put up with it. That does happen with an NVIDIA. But even that guy, I was like, why do you think NVIDIA has been so successful? He's like, oh, it's because of Jensen. Like even that guy who quit on the spot and couldn't take it. Like this guy's an extraordinary manager. If you're willing to kowtow to him, he just couldn't do it. So that does happen. There's an element of, I would say, I wouldn't call it toxicity, but we hear about this in other domains, right? A great military general is not necessarily your friend. He might really drive you hard. I was reading about the Manhattan Project. It was run by a guy named General Groves. This is in Richard Rhodes' fantastic book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb. And one of the guys who works for Groves described him this way, and this is a paraphrase, but it's roughly close. He was like, yeah, Groves was the biggest son of a bitch I ever met in my life. I hated every moment I worked for him, and I woke up every day resenting him. And if I had to pick somebody to do the Manhattan Project again, he's the only guy I'd pick.
Very interesting. Well, here at the close,
I think that's Jensen too.
That sounds like it. Yeah, seriously, that's interesting. I'd love for you to paint a picture of the optimist and the pessimist view of NVIDIA going forward, the bull case, the bear case from your perspective. What will keep this party going, and what are the risks that might have it concluding at some point?
I'm going to invert the question, do the bear case first.
Please.
So the bear case is happening right now. Google has just produced a world-class AI, Gemini, that is actually on the top of the leaderboards. It's at the top of the benchmarks, ahead of ChatGPT, ahead of Claude and Grok. It did not use NVIDIA equipment. They used their own internally developed microchip called a tensor processing unit, or TPU. They built their own stack. And so now there's evidence that you can build a world-class AI out of the NVIDIA ecosystem. Well, that's bad for NVIDIA for a variety of reasons. First of all, Google might win this whole thing, and then NVIDIA would really be, struggling. Or they might open up their TPU architecture for leasing to other people, build their own firm and stack around that, and then beat NVIDIA that way. So that's a huge risk. I'm actually surprised NVIDIA stock is not down more on the basis of that, because I perceive it as being a very serious risk to NVIDIA's platform dominance. And that's only one of several. Broadcom is building its own infrastructure. They're doing well. AMD is building its own infrastructure. And then, of course, we have the parallel universe of China building its own infrastructure. Jensen has lobbied very hard with Trump to get his microchips available for sale in China. But the Chinese authorities, the CCP, has basically discouraged domestic researchers from using this equipment. They want to build their own stack, and that could definitely happen too. So this stranglehold on the AI training market, 80 to 90% market share that NVIDIA has enjoyed, can disappear. And if that is evaporated, the stock price, I presume, will go down a lot. Risk two, this is still the bear case, is that AI disappoints. That we hit that kind of plateau. It is not an immutable fact of the physical universe that if we throw more microchips at AI, it will get better. That has been true for a while, but probably like everything else in human existence, it's subject to, or physical existence, it's subject to some kind of S-curve plateauing eventually. It's an empirical question of when or if that will occur, and I don't think anyone can answer it, but it could happen tomorrow. If AI started slowing down, if it turns out that the systems we have aren't good enough, then demand for NVIDIA's product will also evaporate and go away. And then obviously kind of the third big bear case is, this would be more of a bear case for the United States economy in general. But if China were to invade Taiwan, that would be extremely disruptive. It would be bad for the whole global economy, but it would be especially bad for Nvidia. I mean, everything would go down in that scenario. So there's some bear cases for you. The bull case is that Jensen is the single most capable individual I have ever met. He's truly brilliant. He works very hard on all of this stuff, and he's always good at finding that next $0 billion market. I'm writing about this right now for the New Yorker. The next market probably is robotics. There's a ton of money going into robotics, and especially like home humanoid robotics, also industrial robotics. When I met Jensen in 2023, we were at Denny's, and I was asking him about the future, and he just started talking about robots even then. He was like, everywhere you look, there's going to be an autonomous robot or vehicle. There's going to be one vacuuming the floor here in Denny's. You're not even going to notice. It's just always going to be there. And he went on to say, anything that moves will be made autonomous. Now, the bull case, and this is big for NVIDIA, right now, when we use AI, we put in our request, and then it's taken off to some data center somewhere. It's processed and then delivered back to us. But for robots, we can't really do that because there's too much lag in communicating with the data center coming back. The robot has to ask in real time. This is known as edge computing. So we have to put the microchip right in the brain of the robot. That's edge computing. And right now, every robot manufacturer I talk to is using NVIDIA's Jetson microchip. So that's a huge potential market for them. If Jensen is correct, and I think he probably will be, that everything's going to be autonomous and it's all running NVIDIA silicon, that is $2 to $3 trillion more in market capitalization over where they already are. Jensen's giving the keynote lecture at CES in Las Vegas in the beginning of January. I will be there. It's just going to be all robots at CES this year. It's the year of the humanoid robot and other robots at CES. That stuff is coming, and they're getting close. It's, we've kind of conquered generative AI. We've conquered image AI. Now it's physical AI. That's where the money is going. And so I think Jensen feels like he's a step ahead of Google. They're still training LLMs. We're doing physical AI now. And by physical, we mean physics. We're going to simulate with great fidelity how these robots navigate the real world environment. And Jensen is looking to absolutely control and dominate that space. And not only that, when he told me about this way back in 2023 for the first time, I was like, what are you talking about? As usual, he was way ahead of everybody. Now it's coming, his vision is coming into reality, and they have a controlling interest in it. They're ahead. So that's a good bull case for NVIDIA. Second bull case is medicine. I think that's going to be a very big bull case for them. I think there's a lot of very fascinating work going on in, kind of like not just drug discovery, but even stuff like, one guy I talked to was like, if you think of the nucleotide bases of DNA, CG, TNA, those are like the source code for biology. I want to build a programmable compiler that will take any code and build any tissue that you ask it to do. Like a little machine that if you give it the right code, it'll build you brain tissue. It'll build you a new kidney, like synthetically. So that could obviously be a huge market if that ever came to pass. I think we're a few years away from that, but it's theoretically possible. And I know Jensen wants to be right in the middle of that too. So, the bull case is their orders look great for now, even with Google's arrival. As Google pulls ahead, ChatGPT, Anthropic, Grok, everyone else is going to redouble their efforts. And that means spending more money on NVIDIA equipment. They continue to produce these new AI chips at a blistering pace. I don't know if Google can keep up with that. They're just not geared that way. They're not wired in the same way that Jensen and NVIDIA are for rapid speed, frantic 6-month development cycles. That's not Google's strength. Google's strength is much more kind of cerebral, long-term stuff. So we'll see. But I think that's the bull case for NVIDIA. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that could go right. From a valuation perspective, if you look forward, they're not that expensive, actually. And it could be the case that there just simply is not enough money in the world. I think this was more true 6 months ago than now, but there simply is not enough investment capital in the world to buy the stock up to the proper valuation. That's an unusual problem that only a few companies will ever have. That was true of Apple in like 2012. I remember talking to people and they're like, why does Apple have a 14 PE when they control this market, right? And some people are like, yeah, I just think there's not enough money. I just don't think there's enough money in the world to push the stock up as high as it needs to go.
Fascinating. Well, hey, Stephen Witt, I want to thank you again for a terrific conversation. The book is The Thinking Machine, and it is a terrific read. We've only scratched the surface on the many great stories you tell, and appreciate you sharing some of them here. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. This was fun.